Good afternoon. Welcome to Ron's Ramblings. This will be number 8 in our series. We're studying the roll call of the faithful that's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. And today our subject is Enoch. Enoch is the second one on the list of the faithful. It's listed in Hebrews chapter 11. And as you can see on the slide, it is said of him, by faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him. For before his translation, he had this testimony, that he pleased God. If you don't already, you need to be aware that there were actually 2 individuals listed in the book of Genesis with the name of Enoch. The first one was the son of Cain, that's mentioned in Genesis chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, I think. And it was after Cain had killed his brother Abel and had received that curse from God that his life was spared and he was allowed to leave. And when he did, it is said of him that he went out of the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod. That land of Nod is actually a Hebrew word that has just been kind of transliterated over into the English. And it actually means a vagrancy, a wandering. And it's said that Nod is east of Eden, but it's more commonly thought that there never really existed a particular plot of ground that was called Nod. Rather, it was a descriptive term that was applied to the area east of Eden, in which Cain never really settled down. He was a wanderer, a vagabond, and so he lived somewhere east of Eden. He did have a son, and his name was Enoch. I kind of think that's his first son, but I can't be certain of that. But Cain did build a city that he built it for his son, and he named it Enoch, named the city Enoch. But that Enoch, the city, nor the son of Cain, is the Enoch that is spoken about in Hebrews chapter 11. In fact, the Enoch that we're talking about in chapter 11 of Hebrews, the one that pleased God, lived quite a bit later in life. As a matter of fact, I've got a chart up on the screen now for you to look at. It's a small portion of an overall tremendously large chart that I created a long time ago. I spent a great deal of time constructing actually many of these charts, many of the many parts of them. I constructed one huge chart that is actually unprintable, I think. But I can use that chart to take little sections of it out during the times that I'm studying, because I have found this to be an extremely helpful tool to use in the time that we study the scriptures, and actually in a number of different ways. But what I'm wanting to do today is just to simply show you that the 2 Enochs, where they fit in the overall scheme of things. As you see on the chart, the labels across the top, and you can add other things besides that. but these are the ones that I wanted just for this thing today. You'll see on the left-hand side, the left-hand column of that chart is the name of the patriarch. And the next column over is how long he lived. And the third column over is the name of one of that patriarch's sons. It doesn't have to be his first son, because the genealogy, as long as it is kept accurately, doesn't depend on the first son in the Old Testament, but the son that God picked. And that's why you don't see Cain and Abel on these charts. You don't find them listed on any of the genealogy charts that are in the book of Genesis or even in the Old Testament, because God's purpose was to trace the lineage all the way down to his son Christ. And neither Cain nor Abel is in that. You will notice the first thing on the chart is first son of Adam, or the son of Adam, that is shown on the chart is Seth. And Seth was born at 100, when Adam was 130 years old. That's what that next column that I have labeled age is. That column is the age of the father when the son is born. In that particular case, Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. And then right below that, you see Seth, and he was 105 years old when Enos was born. And then the last column over to the right of this chart is one that I have labeled AC, and that stands for after creation. And that becomes a very important part of the chart in the overall, the large chart, because it allows, with good research and with correct math, this actually establishes an unbroken line, an unbroken chronology of the Old Testament. And as I said, it becomes very useful as you do your study. I said a few minutes ago that Cain, the son of Cain named Enoch, was not the Enoch of Hebrews 5, and that's true. The genealogy in Genesis does not include them, as we've said already. But we know they existed because chapter 4 tells us that they did, and explains a little bit about their life. I don't know when they were born. I don't know the age that Adam was when they were born, because we're not given that. But most scholars think that Cain and Abel were born probably when Adam was 50 years old or less. Now, I don't know where they obtained that figure, but that's what they think, and it doesn't really matter, so that's fine with me. The chart, though, shows that Adam lived to be 930 years old, and during that 930 years, minus the period that he lived in the garden, he sired sons and daughters. And one of Adam's sons was Seth, as we've talked about. He was born when Adam was 130 years old, and that occurred at 130 years after creation, since he's the first one mentioned. But if you look down at Seth, you'll see that he lived 912 years, in which he produced sons and daughters. And one of those sons was named Enos, and Enos was born when Seth was 105 years old, and that would have occurred at 235 years after creation. And you can look on down the chart and see how that goes. And you can see down to Enoch. I've got his name highlighted in yellow print. This is the Enoch that is listed in Hebrews chapter 11. Chapter 11. His father's name was Jared, and he lived 622 years. He was born 622 years after creation, which is at least 500 or right close to 500 years after Seth was born. And we know that Cain was before that. So Cain's son Enoch, especially if it was his first son, would have been many years before. You might also notice on this chart, and I stopped it at Noah for this reason, that Enoch's great-grandson was Noah. Noah was born to Lamech 1,056 years after creation. And if you will remember, the great flood happened during Noah's 600th year on the earth, which would put it at 1,656 years after the creation. But it is Enoch that we're talking about, the son of Jared, and that's the one that is spoken of in Hebrews chapter 11. And the author of Hebrews continues the statement that he made in regard to Enoch by saying, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him." The him in verse 6 is God. And I want to emphasize that with a different reading of that by replacing the word God where it needs to be, so that you can see exactly what it is that verse is saying. The point of that is it says that Enoch pleased God. And in order to be pleasing to God, according to Hebrews 11, verse 5, you must be one who diligently seeks God. Enoch did that, or he wouldn't have been pleasing to God. Now, the Greek word that is translated diligently seek, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, is exateo. And it means to search out, to investigate, to crave, or to demand. And all of those characteristics must stem from a Hebrewism, which means worship. So in order to properly worship God and be pleasing to God in that worship, then we must diligently seek him. We must search him out. We must crave or demand him to be in our lives and to rule our lives. That's what Enoch did. And as a result of that, it says that Enoch pleased God. He diligently sought God, and it was counted to him for faith. The book of Genesis says that Enoch walked with God. Can there be a better thing that can be said about a person than to say he walked with God? The word translated walk, of course, as I'm sure you know, is how you conduct yourself while you're here on this earth. And it's not just a periodic thing. It's not something that you do every once in a while. Your walk in life is that whole attitude that possesses your life from beginning to end. That from beginning meaning when you're able to think things through and make decisions for yourself. And to have that said about you, that you were faithful and pleasing to God throughout your life. I don't think there could be anything better that could be said about you. You know, we're able to read just about everything that's said about Enoch in a very short time. By the standard of the day, Enoch didn't live very long. He only lived 365 years. And in that 365th years, um, he was taken by God. He had numerous offspring during that time. And but the thing that we most need to know about him is that he pleased God. And because of that, he did not die. He was taken by God in that 365th year of his life. And that was because his faith allowed him to escape death. There's only two people mentioned in the Bible as being taken. Enoch is one of them. He didn't have to experience death, but he went straight to heaven. The other was the prophet Elijah. 2 Kings outlines that record and says that Elijah was taken into heaven in a chariot of fire. And it was done during his ministry, while his ministry was going on. And as a result, it was left up to Elisha to take over his ministry and continue and going on. So those two, Elijah and Enoch, were the only two that we have recorded in the scriptures that did not have to experience death and went to heaven. They underwent a change, of course. We all know that you can't, that this body that we possess can't live in heaven. It's not an eternal body. Heaven is an eternal place. And so a new body is required, and they underwent a change when that transpired. But neither of them had to experience the physical death and burial that all of the rest of us on this earth have to experience unless we're alive when Christ comes the second time. So why was Enoch taken when all of the other greats in Hebrews 11 had to experience death? Well, I can't answer that question. I don't know. The only thing I can say is what I've already told you. There are some who make all kinds of reasons. A common thought is that Enoch lived during a period of time where the norm was to live 800 or 900 years. And because God knew that during the next few hundred years, the inhabitants of earth were going to descend into utter depravity, so much so that he caused the flood, and that God didn't want Enoch to have to live through all of that. I don't believe that for a minute. I think that's just someone making some things up in order to appease what they believe. I believe in the part about the mankind degrading itself into a total moral depravity. We see that as fact. And yes, that's why God caused the flood. However, we've got some clues that tell us a little about that. In Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, we find recorded that God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Now, that's the condition that existed when he caused Noah to build the ark and cause the flood to come so that Noah could save his family and all of the animals that would have otherwise perished. Uh, it wasn't the moral decay that having started just when God saw it there in Genesis chapter 6, because uh, that's already into Noah's life. It started way before that. As a matter of fact, if you look really carefully back up in verses 2 and 3 of Genesis chapter 6, you'll find that it reads, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." Now, we don't have time to discuss it here, but God never intended for man to do that. God's intent was one man with one woman for as long as they both lived. So the thing that began this moral depravity that is spoken of there in Genesis chapter 6 says that it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and when they saw the daughters that were born unto the men, that the sons began to take for themselves whomever they chose, and as many as they chose, to be their wives. It got so bad that God said, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." After the flood, there were some that lived longer than that, but you see very quickly the lifespan of man reducing from those long years that they lived before the flood. Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah, Enoch's, was he Enoch's son or grandson? I can't remember right now, but he lived to be 969 years old. He was the oldest man that ever lived on the earth. But after the flood, man didn't live that long. Shem is said to have been the oldest person after the flood, and of course, he was already born prior to that, and Shem lived a good long life. However, it was when men began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them that God says that's when this moral depravity began. Well, just when was that? When did that happen? Isn't that what we saw when Adam and Eve left the garden? Isn't it true that when Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden, didn't God tell the woman that he would greatly multiply her conception? I think it happened immediately after they left the garden. Daughters were born to Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel were born, but it says that Adam lived 930 years and begat sons and daughters. I don't know how many he had, but if I can interpret what he said, what God said accurately, then the normal thing today didn't exist then. Women had many more children then than they do today. Now I think we say that we just kind of want to keep things on an even balance, and they recommend that a family has only 2 or 3 children or 4. Back then, they had many more than that. And so that period of when people began to multiply on the face of the earth started just shortly after Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden. And so what I see in regard to Enoch is the same thing I see in regard to Elijah. They were two faithful men living in a wicked situation where the generations were wicked, yet they were keeping the faith. I believe that what happened to Enoch is a precursor of what will happen to the faithful saints who happen to still be alive on the earth when Jesus comes to gather his faithful. We are told that we will ascend into the clouds to meet him, never having to experience the pangs of an earthly death. As Christians in today's society, we also live in a morally depraved world, and it's roaring toward its end like a runaway locomotive. But for the faithful, there is a reward promised. As Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, beginning in verse 15, he says, "For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which were alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which were asleep." Remember, the people at Thessalonica were worried that those who had already died had missed the resurrection. And Paul was correcting that. But he continues and says, "For the Lord himself shall descend from the heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain on earth shall be caught up together with them in the clouds, to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord." What a great and wonderful day that will be for those who are faithful. We need to prepare ourselves for that day because we don't know when that will be. We need to be like Enoch. We need to make our walk in life to be pleasing to the Lord, which means we follow him, we search for him, and we do his commands. I hope you have a good day. Thanks for watching. Good evening.